Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing A Test Case for America, Washington, Longfellow, and the Jewish Community at Newport, Rhode Island. I'm J.L. Bell, historian of the American Revolution, and I'll be your moderator for this program. This month, we've seen reports from around the world of riots, some of them fatal, protesting a video designed to insult Muslims. The current presidential election has brought a partisan argument over the definition of religious freedom, as well as from the margins, questions about both major candidates' faith. Our American Republic has actually been wrestling with these issues of religious tolerance since the beginning. Back in August 1790, the new president, George Washington, made a ceremonial visit to Newport, Rhode Island. Moses Satius, warden of Congregation Kahal Kedosh Yeshuat Israel, now known as the Touro Synagogue, welcomed the new president. And Washington's public response promised equality for the Jewish community in the new republic. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. Washington's letter is seen as a foundation of American religious liberty and of the principle of the separation of church and state. Each year, the Touro Synagogue rereads it in a public ceremony. How did the ideal of religious tolerance become part of American social values? Has the United States historically lived up to Washington's promise? And how have later generations approached the issue, and where are the key challenges for today? These are some of the questions that our speaker will address as we explore what he calls the curious history of religious tolerance in America. Ted Widmer is a historian who has brought his talents to the worlds of academia, politics, and rock and roll. He has just completed a 6-year tenure as the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, and will soon take up the dual role of special assistant advisor to the president of Brown and special assistant to the Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Ted Widmer is the author of Young America, The Flowering of Democracy in New York City, and the biography Martin Van Buren in the American President series. Formerly director of speechwriting at the National Security Council, he edited the Library of America collection, American Speeches, Political Oratory from Patrick Henry to Barack Obama. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Ted Widmer.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Pat. Thank you all for bearing with us, not only during the 20 minutes or so of technical delays, but the 3 months from the time I was supposed to give these remarks. I got a severe attack of pneumonia in early June, and I was still ready to come up and give the talk, and Laura Nash said, no way, not only for my own benefit, but for all of your benefit, so you wouldn't get my illness. But we persevered, and I'm really glad to be here tonight, and I'm grateful to all of the sponsors here. I'm grateful to many friends who came, Tom Beal, Laura's husband, Joyce Chaplin from Harvard's history department, Alan Wolfe, great historian of religion, is here. The great expert on the topic I want to talk about tonight is Professor Jonathan Sarna of Brandeis University, and he's here. The great expert on me is my mother. Yeah, she's here also. And I want to talk briefly about another person. The great expert on my mother is my grandmother, who's still alive. She's 99 years old, Concord, New Hampshire, and she grew up a little girl in Cambridge and is still reading Longfellow, and in fact sent citations that I needed to know about to get ready for this talk. She found Longfellow's journal entry from 1852 when he wandered into the Jewish cemetery in Newport, so I wanted to mention her as well. Well, as John said, I want to reflect on religious freedom in these remarks, which I've been told should be about 20 minutes for the broadcast purposes. I have more to say, and we may have more time afterwards, but I will give an abbreviated version of what I prepared. Last week, 2 events reminded us how much we still are working on an issue that we often think is resolved, but it isn't. In the middle of the East River in New York, Louis Kahn's monument to Franklin Roosevelt's 4 Freedoms was finally unveiled. The plans were in his briefcase when he died in 1974, and it's taken 4 decades, but the monument is there. One of those freedoms, of course, is freedom of worship. And across the world, across the Atlantic and the Middle East, in a number of disturbing events, very disturbing, we saw how divisive religion still can be in many parts of the world. And tonight I'd like to get at that topic through the lens of two Cantabrigians, George Washington and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I know neither was a true Cantabrigian. I sometimes wonder if such a thing even exists. That's the whole point. We become Cantabrigian by choice rather than by DNA or destiny. But if they were not natives, they spent a lot of time here. Washington, of course, as the commander-in-chief of the American forces at the beginning of the American Revolution, the office he received on or around July 3rd, 1775. The monument marking that spot where he took command is probably the most dangerous monument in the United States. Do any of you know where it is? You do? I've been wanting to read that plaque my entire life. It's suicidal to read it. It is a plaque that looks a lot like a manhole cover, and it is at the intersection of Mason Street and Garden Street in what is now called Margaret Fuller Square. Margaret Fuller Square is a new square, I think, and it's not near Margaret Fuller's house. It's right in front of the First Congregational Church, just on the other side of Christ Church, walking up towards Garden Street and Concord Avenue. And if you are backed up in traffic going up Garden Street, you might see a gold-shaped manhole cover. But it's not a manhole cover, it's an actual historic marker that is on the site of where the Washington elm was, the elm tree under which Washington took command. And the only way to read it is to stand in the middle of Garden Street and look down while cars are going on either side of you. And I've never read it until tonight. About an hour ago, I thought I have to read it for this talk, and I ran out at rush hour. And fortunately, I couldn't read it and remain alive or standing to give this talk. But because of the advent of cell phone technology, I was able to run, take a picture, and keep going and read the picture on my iPhone afterwards. And it says, I almost hate to reveal the mystery because it should be a rite of passage for Cantabrigians, but it said, "Here stood the Washington elm under which George Washington took command in 1775." Not the most exciting message for all that work, but there you go. Longfellow lived here for a much longer period, 1836 to 1882, almost 50 years with some time off to wander Europe. He came here young and obscure, professor of languages at Harvard, and over the course of the 19th century became old and famous, America's most beloved poet. And of course, as most of you know, they are joined by the historic fact that they both lived in the same house, a house that has served as a monument to continuity in Cambridge for more than 200 years, despite more than a few names to describe this unchanging place. It was called the Vassal House when Washington moved in, and there was irony in the fact that the rebel commander was occupying a loyalist mansion. Then it was the Craigie House when Longfellow moved in. And now, of course, that Longfellow does not live there, it's known as the Longfellow House, or more exactly, the Longfellow House, Washington Headquarters, National Historic Site. It's charming that two such famous people lived in the same dwelling, and it's even more charming that they were so different. America's greatest man of action and one of our greatest fable spinners, a man who took actions and spun their gossamer into stories that helped Americans to understand the very complex country we had already become by 1836, when Longfellow moved in, a time when the United States certainly felt young, surging with Jacksonian energy, and yet Harvard was already 200 years old, Cambridge even older. Besides their cohabitation of the same house, there's one very specific way in which Washington and Longfellow co-occupy American history, a kind of rhyme that allows these two Americans so different to once again walk through the same rooms. Each put significant thought into Judaism and found in one small example, the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, overarching meaning for the kind of country the United States was trying to become. Specifically, they saw evidence in this tiny demographic sample that America was capable of ethnic diversity, religious toleration, and cohabitation. With their public comments on this subject, these two co-occupants of the same house let it be known that in their very different ways they approved. Today, it's an article of faith that the United States stands for freedom of worship. It's something we all believe in, left and right, although perhaps for different reasons on the left and right. And yet it was one of the harder freedoms to establish. It certainly did not come over the ocean with the original settlers of Cambridge and Massachusetts, the Puritans who came here in 1630 and founded this historic congregation would have scoffed at the idea that people were free to worship in the best way they saw fit. In fact, they did much more than scoff at it. They banished people for expressing it, which may explain why Rhode Island, where I live, had nearly as strong population growth throughout the colonial period as Massachusetts. When this meeting house was built, 1833, only 3 years before Longfellow moved here, Massachusetts was in the final year of compulsory tax support of a single church, what is now the Congregational Church. That was the last gasp of state-sponsored religion, an idea that is still prevalent around the world, but which Rhode Island quite effectively undermined here in New England. It's one of Rhode Island's few victories over Massachusetts, a battle that has been one-sided ever since Rhode Island was created by Massachusetts by kicking out our founder, Roger Williams, creating the precedent of the bad place where bad people go, a kind of mulch pile not too far from the garden being tended by the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay. I myself was a Cantabrigian for a long time, during which I shared the prevailing Massachusetts attitude towards Rhode Island, which is that if we have to mention it at all, let's be as condescending as possible. Cotton Mather, the 17th and 18th century theologian, called Rhode Island the latrina of New England. Not latrine, but latrina. It's a little more condescending that way. But Rhode Island has always challenged Massachusetts to think more broadly because it so obviously failed to live up to the standards of human perfection that Massachusetts was forever trying to inflict on everyone. And it didn't endure any of the various dooms that Massachusetts was predicting for those who failed to toe the line. Our failure to go to hell has been a thorn in our neighbor's side for nearly 400 years. From that original banishment of Roger Williams, Rhode Island became a kind of receptacle for people who were lost and did not fit in. A latrina, as Cotton Mather said, or a sewer. And so it was here in Newport, the New England port closest to the Caribbean, that Jews began to drift in the later decades of the 17th century. A very small number came to Massachusetts, and one recent scholar, Michael Hoberman, has estimated that a grand total of 3 passed through Massachusetts Bay during the 17th century. But in Newport, to the south, they began to form a real community. Were the Jews of Newport the first Jews in what is now the United States? That's a very complex question. There was a school of thought that the Native Americans themselves were quasi-Jewish, descended from the famous lost tribes of Israel, and some of the earliest anthropologists among the Puritans, people like John Eliot, floated theories to that effect based on certain parallels that they wanted perhaps too desperately to find, especially during millennial excitements like the 1650s. Intriguingly, the Puritans themselves were a bit Jewish. They themselves often forced the comparison. They were certainly people of the book, deeply immersed in the Hebrew Old Testament, from which they drew not only spiritual illumination, but the law of everyday life. The great Puritan leader John Cotton proposed an early version of Mosaic law for all of Massachusetts, based on the Ten Commandments to govern the people of this Bible commonwealth. Its provisions were harsh, not all that different from what we would now recognize as Sharia law, for example, death for blasphemy or for worshiping a graven image. But they were ultimately not adopted by the Puritans, who saw even in these early years that they were not pragmatic. It was precisely this blurring of spiritual and secular roles by the magistracy of Massachusetts that Roger Williams objected to and which led to his banishment. But the Puritans looked up to the Abrahamic tradition as one they sought to emulate, and they infused their life with Judaic similitudes. They themselves certainly wandered in the wilderness. They combed the Old Testament for names for their children. They laboriously wrote out Hebrew lessons. One of the great books of the 17th century is William Bradford's History of Plymouth Plantation, and the manuscript, which is kept in a library at the State House in Boston, contains doodles of his Hebrew lessons on the inside. Here in Harvard Square in 1640, the great Bay Psalm book, the first book to be printed in what would become the United States, was assembled laboriously, richly decorated with Hebrew type specimens to show off the learning of these people so proud to issue their first book. Between 1642 and 1646, Harvard students studied Hebrew twice a day. In the 17th century, 18 Harvard theses were written on Hebrew subjects, including Cotton Mather's. But if this was already a striving community, it was not yet a tolerant one, open to any who would call himself or herself Cantabrigian. Rhode Island, as I said, was different. After Roger Williams was banished, he came to Rhode Island in 1636 and established what we would today call a big tent. In his case, the term may have been literal because the Native Americans were key to his survival in his early months. Soon after his arrival, he invited other settlers who sought freedom of conscience, and so an unusual collection of free thinkers began to gather very early around the shores of Narragansett Bay. Like William Bradford, William studied Hebrew throughout his life of insatiable curiosity. He received lessons in it from, of all people, the poet John Milton, to whom he taught Dutch. And so it should not surprise us that Williams explicitly mentioned the stock of Abraham when he defined the big tent he was trying to build there. He spoke in both generalities. He said forced worship stinks in God's nostrils, and in particulars. Went out of his way to mention, quote, Jews and Turks over and over again as he described the haven he was trying to build for those seeking liberty of conscience. But that was a theory only until the first Jews began to arrive in Rhode Island and put the theory to the test. A small number may have come in 1658, and for decades that was the date given to the arrival of the first Jews in Rhode Island, allegedly from Barbados. We have an interesting historiographical problem in that the document that asserted that claim from 1658 is no longer with us. Historians who wrote books in the earlier part of the 20th century saw it and claimed their conclusions based on reading it, but we no longer have the original document. But we do know that in 1677, the Jewish community in Newport acquired a small plot of land in Newport for a burial ground, a deep sign of a community. And from that moment on, we know that they cohabited quite peacefully with the other peoples of Newport. Beginning in the 1750s, 70 years later, there was a significant influx of Jews from Portugal, fleeing the Inquisition and the earthquake of 1755. And then for about 20 years, we entered the glory period of the Jewish community at Newport. They traded in the Caribbean like other New Englanders. They dabbled in the slave trade like New Englanders. And they built an exquisite meeting house like New Englanders. The Toro Synagogue, built between 1759 and 1763, is one of the prettier buildings of the 18th century, designed by the great architect Peter Harrison, who designed Christ Church just down the street and King's Chapel in Boston. All of these buildings are nearly contemporaneous. Only small clues, an odd angle allowing the synagogue to face Jerusalem, reveals that this is not an 18th century Christian meeting house. But like many religious buildings, it also served a civic function. In the early 1780s, the Rhode Island General Assembly and Supreme Court met there. Like all of Newport, Toro suffered badly during the American Revolution. Many congregants moved away to the Caribbean or to New York. Even after independence was won and the new government of the United States came into being, Rhode Island had a very hard time. Rhode Islanders, being truculent by nature, vastly preferred the loose government of the Articles of Confederation to the strong government of the Constitution, which almost seemed designed to punish Rhode Island. Rhode Island did not even condescend to send delegates to the Convention of 1787. It simply pretended that the new United States did not exist. When Washington became president 2 years later, 1789, Rhode Island was still an outlier to the new country, as it had been for so much of its history. It didn't want to pay taxes. It didn't want to join a union that seemed to punish small states. and it did not especially need the other 12 states. We might have become the Andorra of America, a tiny nation mainly of interest for its postage stamps, tax loopholes, and quirky cuisine. But the economic pressure was mounting, and there was something impressive about the United States of America beyond its size. Here was the first government ever dedicated to the idea that citizens possess rights. It was a stirring vision that Rhode Island had itself helped to shape, for no state had done more to work out the knotty problem of religious toleration and the related issue of freedom of speech. The First Amendment to the Constitution, proposed in 1789, approved in 1791 at exactly this moment, guaranteed precisely the rights to freedom of worship and of speech that Rhode Islanders had always embraced. If the new government was not perfect, it had at least Rhode Islandized itself in this respect. And so finally, in 1790, by the narrow vote of 34 to 32, Rhode Island joined the United States. In celebration, the new president, George Washington, decided to visit the difficult state in August of 1790, as John mentioned. He himself had a strong relationship with Rhode Islanders. His chief adjutant was the General Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, and it was in the context of this triumphant visit that he exchanged his now famous letters with the warden of Touro Synagogue, Moses Seixas. The first, a letter from Moses Seixas to him, paid the respects of the congregation to the new president. The second, more widely quoted letter was George Washington's response. He was far from the greatest writer of the founders, but there was a force and a clarity to this general's thinking that still moves us. Obviously, he was inspired by the first letter, and he borrowed some of its evocative language about the stock of Abraham. But clearly, he was also impressed by the idea behind Touro Synagogue that we are a nation of many nations. And everything he did in 1790, his first full year as president, set an important precedent, as he knew well. In 1790, at the same time that he came to Rhode Island, the first stirrings of our party system were in the air, to his great distress. He did not want a bifurcated nation in which parties were endlessly scheming for advantage, always at each other's throats. Like Roger Williams, he wanted to govern a united community that protected the rights of all of its citizens. So today we celebrate Washington's letter to Touro for its openness of spirit and its specific implications for Jewish Americans, but we also need it for its timely reminder to restore civility to our public life. We can disagree on religious and political matters without denying each other's birthrights, as we so often do, sometimes literally, as in the case of our president. We can disagree on mundane topics like taxes or debt ceilings without denying the right of our opponents to exist. We can disagree with our elected officials without attacking the ability of our government to meet its obligations. Having left a significant impression upon American history already by 1790, the Jews of Newport then did something rather uncharacteristic in our history. They began to disappear. Unlike Cambridge and so many other American communities, they did not flourish and grow in the 19th century. In fact, they essentially moved out of Newport by 1822, heading mainly to New York, but to a few other places. However, their example endured. The Bunker Hill Monument, a great civic achievement of Boston, could not have been finished if it were not for the financial help of Judah Touro, a son of the Newport community, born the day before the Battle of Bunker Hill, who contributed very meaningfully to the completion of the monument. And their memory served an interesting purpose in the years leading up to the Civil War, a time of growing intolerance and incivility. Which brings me to part two of our story, Longfellow's decision to take a vacation in Newport in 1852, and his own profound encounter with Jewish history. The fact that the Jews were no longer really there for the most part did not deter him. It may even have added to their appeal. Frankly, it would have been amazing if Longfellow did not wander into the Jewish cemetery in 1852 and write about it. He knew something about the old Hebraic vision of New England. His mother's first name was Zilpah, named after the handmaid of Leah in the book of Genesis. And he was never lacking in industry. One of his more famous poems, immortalized for students of a certain generation on the TV show The Brady Bunch, was "The Day is Done." And in effect, the day was never done for Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was always looking for poetic inspiration, When he came to Newport, it was already popular as a destination, including for many Southerners who came north to escape the heat. He was naturally predisposed to romanticize his surroundings wherever he went. He wrote, quote, "The sea spoke Italian at Newport, Norse at Nahant, but evidently it also spoke other languages at Newport, many of them, and that's why he grew so fond of Newport." When he wandered into the Jewish cemetery that day, he had an epiphany. It's easy to see why. The gravestones, still legible in that cemetery, are written in many languages: Spanish, Hebrew, Latin, and English. Longfellow, of course, was a translator and a professor with a special interest in the Iberian languages here at Harvard. Second, poets naturally like to be melancholy. Longfellow had a special interest in wandering, soon-to-be extinct peoples. Evangeline worked that theme, so did Hiawatha. Third, to be melancholy in a cemetery was the most sublime form of melancholy. It's an old poetic tradition. Thomas Gray's elegy written in a village churchyard is a well-known example. Longfellow milked this tradition for all it was worth. In the same book in which he published his poem, The Jewish Cemetery at Newport, a book titled Birds of Passage, came out in 1858, he also published In the Churchyard at Cambridge, about the cemetery just outside these windows. So let me summarize. Longfellow was reading Spanish and Portuguese and Hebrew inscriptions about a wandering people while melancholy in a cemetery and on his summer vacation. In other words, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had hit the trifecta. But Longfellow's poem was important to him. We don't always think of him as a polemical writer like Whittier or Emerson or Thoreau, but the early 1850s were a time of growing rage against the South and the Fugitive Slave Act in particular, universal rage here in Boston and Cambridge. After escaped slaves were arrested in Boston and remanded on several occasions in the early 1850s, no one could remain indifferent. Amos Lawrence, the industrialist, said, "We went to bed one night, old-fashioned conservative compromise Union Whigs. We woke up stark mad abolitionists." Longfellow's poem is a lament, but I believe it's also a warning. His two cemetery poems together about Cambridge and Newport contain more than a little frustration. The Cambridge poem describes the grave of an old Tory woman buried with the slaves buried at her feet, somewhere out in that graveyard. And Longfellow added the point that their ashes were as white as hers. The plight of the Jews was, of course, different, but it's clear that he felt great sympathy for any underdog peoples, and he felt that America was in danger of extinction as well. So once again, Newport's Jews spoke to the country writ large. From the grave, they warned against victimhood and against letting history be taken away. It's an unfinished thought that I would say I'm putting a little bit into his own words, but I think he linked the slaves of this cemetery with what he thought the extinct Jewish population of the Newport Cemetery, with his feeling that all of the North was becoming increasingly enslaved by the slave power and that it was time to wake up and take action. Longfellow may have considered the story finished when he buried Newport's last Jews in their old cemetery, but in fact they had not quite vanished. In fact, summer services had been resumed at Truro in 1850, 2 years before his visit. But the cemetery and synagogue would continue to attract attention at important moments. Emma Lazarus, the great poetess who wrote the poem inscribed at the Statue of Liberty, also wrote a poem about the Jewish congregation at Newport, in which she celebrated its survival, not its disappearance. And in 1946, an important year, the Truro Synagogue became designated a National Historic Site, fully embraced by the United States government and President Truman as a fitting emblem of what it meant to be American. Shortly after that, Washington's great letter to Truro Synagogue was included in the Freedom Train, a collection of charter documents that traveled around the United States by rail, reasserting the essential truths of American history. And I want to pause for a moment to say that this great letter of Washington's, which is so important for so many reasons, has been unavailable to view for the last 30 years or so, and it is briefly on view at the moment in Philadelphia. And John, where is the institution where it's visible? the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. So I strongly urge you, if you have the chance, to go see it yourself. So I want to conclude by saying that in this election season, we should remember that we Americans, like Canterburyans, have a choice. We are not part of this elective community by destiny or merely because our ancestors came here. We're here because we want to be here and because we like, or at least accept, the other people we find here with us. Washington, citing Newport's Jews, made America a more tolerant nation in its first year of a fully grown presidency. Longfellow, wandering in his cemeteries, reminded Americans not to be impressed too much by themselves and their self-appointed destiny. In building a more capacious structure for us all to live in, they had once again become co-occupants of the same big house. In each of these instances, the tiny population of Jews that once occupied a New England seaport stood for something much larger than their congregation or Rhode Island or New England. They stood for an aspirational idea of America, maybe even for something larger than that, the principle that discrimination against any religion is unacceptable. Given the haunting events in the Middle East last week, we should all take as ecumenical a perspective as possible, protecting all people of all faiths. Longfellow would approve, I think. He died in 1882 and entered a Cambridge cemetery for the last time, not this one, but Mount Auburn, where he lies to this day, passing through it, as he did at Newport Jewish Cemetery, through an Egyptian gate. Thank you.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum, listening to Ted Widmer discussing the curious history of religious tolerance in America. Now we'll have the question session. Ted, I'll start out by talking, in the years before radio and television, the printed newspaper was our mass media. And I get the sense that although we think of it's Washington's letter to Moses Seixas and his congregation, but it was also a public document, right? It was all a public, almost a speech today. And I wondered if you could talk about that element of the piece and your experience as a government speechwriter.
Well, you ask a very good question I do not have an immediate answer for. Was it immediately republished in the newspapers? I have a feeling that it was. It certainly ended up being published in the writings of George Washington as they were published in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it became very well known, and by the middle decades of the 20th century was already considered a charter document. Was it published immediately in August 1790? I don't know. If it was, it would have, Newport certainly had newspapers, and so did Providence, and so that's an interesting question that we can look into as historians. As a speechwriter, I would say our words returned a little bit more to what they probably were before they were written down with great frequency, and now very few people read a presidential speech, but there are moments of great oral impact, like Bill Clinton's speech a couple weeks ago at the Democratic National Convention, or Barack Obama's, where once again we become a nation of listeners rather than readers. So these are still very important forms of communication from the elected leader of our government to the people. And the last time I was in this building, there was a debate during the Democratic National Convention in 2004. And it was at that convention, it was a very fun debate. Al Franken, who was not yet a senator, led a spirited defense of, it was an attack on the policies of President Bush. But it was at that convention that famously a young and nearly entirely unknown Barack Obama gave a speech that was so good that it made him president. And it's unusual for something like that to happen. It doesn't happen in too many other nations where you really have to work your way up through the established political channels. And with a single speech in 2004 that knocked all of us out, Barack Obama skipped about 10 levels of political climbing and became a candidate from that moment.
Again, welcome to Cambridge Forum as we continue our discussion with Ted Widmer of Brown University on the strange career of religious tolerance in America. looking back on George Washington's letter to the members of the Truro Synagogue in Newport, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about the same Rhode Island site. At this point in the program, we'll take questions from the audience. Please line up at the microphone in the aisle, and please be succinct in your questions, as there are many others who might have questions as well. So, would anyone like to start us off? Thank you, sir.
I was wondering if you'd comment. We have religious tolerance, but I see it's the Muslims' turn to take jibes. The movie that apparently has caused all the problems overseas, and
Certainly, we want religious toleration to be extended in all directions, toward Muslims by people of other faiths, and from Muslims toward people of other faiths. And there are always going to be examples of intolerance in both of those directions, but we certainly want the toleration to be flowing with equal strength in both directions. The video that caused all this trouble I still have not seen. I think it still remains quite difficult to see. It's an amazing moment in our extremely sophisticated technological time that so much violence can happen and so many reactions can happen to something spreading basically by word of mouth. People, a very shoddy film, poorly made with actors who didn't even know what the film was about, paid for by people who I think paid for a trailer but not an actual movie, could cause all this damage is a rather sad commentary on the state of public information. I think there's plenty of blame to go around. All places, the governments of the Middle East need to suppress riots that target U.S. embassies that should be bastions of tolerance themselves and safety for the professionals working inside of them. But also I think it's outrageous that people are creating movies like this with the explicit intent of achieving exactly the reaction they achieved. And I think we need to think, even though we are all, or I believe that we're all liberally minded in this community, in this city and in this congregation, that do we want rogue elements of our own society going out and creating highly inflammatory works of information designed to cause riots that kill people? I don't think that we do. So we might need to think about the law and more effective ways of punishing people who do this. I'm not a lawyer, but I just think the situation is really tragic, and we need to look deeply into the causes, the actors who created it, but then also work really hard to prevent this kind of mass misunderstanding from happening with the tragic consequences that we all saw.
I have a question, and I wonder if you know the answer. Before I went to visit Truro Synagogue, a friend told me that it had been a station on the Underground Railroad. When I went to visit the rabbi, it was his first week. He didn't really know the history about that, and I wondered if you knew, or if it was rumor or myth.
I don't. That's a good question. It's a good question about a lot of New England, because just about every old house in New England or old town has a link to the Underground Railroad, and I'm convinced that there is a movement among realtors to enhance the value of old buildings by claiming things like that. And the reason I'm dubious, it may be true, and there are very interesting parallels between the Jews, who were an enslaved people at various moments in their history, and the African Americans who were enslaved in the 19th century. Newport has its own very complicated history with slavery, including a lot of traders in the slave trade lived in Newport. But New England was free in general. You didn't have to hide once you got here in general. There were exceptions, and there were these two slaves who were taken into custody in the early 1850s with great controversy in Boston. But I'm not sure if you made it to Newport, Rhode Island, you really needed to be hiding in the basement of a synagogue. So I don't know that if it's true or if it's not true. But I have a feeling there's a tendency, we all have it, it's an innocent tendency, that we see an interesting basement room or hidden room and we think it must have been part of the Underground Railroad. And I'm not sure. We need a little bit better research, and we need a lobby to work against the very powerful lobby of realtors on this question. John?
In your title and indeed in your talk, you spoke much about religious tolerance. In George Washington's letter to the Jews of Newport, there is a remarkable line which reads that it is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. I wonder if you could help us understand the difference in Washington's mind between toleration and inherent natural rights.
That's an excellent question. I'm afraid I will only be able to give a partial answer. And there's also a difference, as you are implying, I think, between natural rights that are assumed and rights that are specifically written in governing documents that protect the citizens of a state or a country. And we were just at that moment we were in between the proposal and the ratification of the First Amendment. So I think that's on his mind, is, are we going to write down that all Americans have this right? But early on, it's I think an assumed right that gentlemanly people talk about, and we all know famously that Thomas Jefferson wrote about men in the Declaration of Independence and not men and women. And we know, most of us now, that Jefferson was a complicated spokesman for rights because he was a slave owner and perhaps in some kind of very complicated spousal arrangement with an African American woman. I don't think we'll ever know the final details of that question, but we know enough that it was a very complicated racial situation, that he spent his life in a complicated racial situation. So it was one thing for men of letters and men of wealth and of property, and property is often the key term in the 18th century, that your rights come from your ownership of land, and not everyone owned land. Recent immigrants did not. But as Washington knew, things were changing quickly in the year 1790, and we were getting up to, the Constitution had been written, the Bill of Rights had not, and the very first right was proposed and about to be ratified, and its ratification was a specific point being used to persuade Rhode Island Rhode Island had come in, but it was still a volatile situation. So by articulating that, remembering nostalgically when a small number of people theorized about that right and then asserting it as a done deal, in effect, I think he was speaking to his Rhode Island audience, but as always to a bigger American audience too, and pushing. I mean, Washington himself had a complicated perspective on this question, but more than Jefferson, I think, took some brave personal action. Jefferson did some interesting things earlier in his career, and later in his life, not so much. Washington, on his deathbed, was very concerned about manumitting his slaves. He could not manumit his wife's. Everything was complicated, but I think Washington had a vision of where this country needed to go. And I think what I'm trying to say about the way this small group of people in Newport was used, it was always about the aspirational America, not America as we actually existed. We're always an imperfect society, but as we needed to be. And that's what made them such an interesting example. Thank you. Alan.
To follow up Jonathan's question, toleration is a word that has two different meanings depending upon whether you use it as a noun or as a verb. Because as a noun, toleration sounds like a good thing. We accept other people's difference. But as a verb, to tolerate has an air of condensation about it and really just doesn't have the same kind of positive connotation. So is there any way of knowing in which of those meanings of toleration
No,
was
that's an
Washington's?
excellent linguistic point, and we need to pay close attention to words. And it's usually tolerance in the British tradition. Is that true, Joyce? Would you agree with that? Tolerance more than toleration? Toleration. So I take that back. But to tolerate implies that a group that possesses power is permitting another group to come into the arrangement. Whereas just to celebrate toleration abstractly means we all have the same right to tolerate everyone else. So I think there is a distinction there that's meaningful. These are all important semantics that I think we are getting better at, but we are still considerably farther ahead in this country, I think, even than our Western European allies. It's one of the things that Americans now generally do take for granted, and we have many people to thank. We have Norman Rockwell, among others, and Franklin Roosevelt, and the great success of the Second World War, in which this became one of the things we were fighting to defend. Roosevelt articulated it as a war aim in the Atlantic Charter in 1940, and clearly Adolf Hitler did not believe in religious toleration. And so since then, it's been comfortable for the United States to assert this claim, but I'm not exactly saying that our Western European allies are opposed to it, but there still is a state church. It's a rather attenuated state church, but in Great Britain. And in France, it's not at all, young people don't grow up imbibing it, breathing the air of toleration to the same extent that I think we do in this country. So, thank you.
Were there religious discriminatory statutes still on the books in the states at the time of the ratification of the First Amendment? And if so, what happened to them?
Yes, here in Massachusetts, it goes to 1833.
By the state legislature?
Well, they weren't discriminatory. They merely assigned the payment of taxes to citizens of Massachusetts that then went to the benefit of only one church, which was the Congregational Church, the descendant of the original Puritan churches. And I think they were able to carry on in the case of Massachusetts to the 1830s. I can't remember. I think that may have been the last state that had a statute like that, which is interesting because we think of Massachusetts as a bastion of free thinking. And in fact, I think it was the last state with a statute like that. But that was, I think, interpreted as a form of taxation, a kind of private fiscal matter within Massachusetts that did not infringe upon the rights of people to worship, but it did infringe upon their pocketbook. It's an interesting distinction. Somehow that right, people were able to worship as they wanted to, but they had to keep supporting a state-supported church for decades afterwards. So,
thank you.
It's significant that the First Amendment is written, Congress shall make no laws respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting, by that it's a very ambiguous language, respecting the establishment. That means Congress can't establish a religion for the United States, but it also can't rule that Massachusetts cannot have an establishment, which it did, as Ted is saying, since the 1830s. And I wonder
that's a good way of saying it.
Yeah, I wonder if Washington, by making this statement, was sort of putting his own preference out there in the discussion of that First Amendment, which you say was going on at the same time in New York.
That's a good point, too. I mean, he seems to be saying, in all these matters, he seems to be taking the higher road than one that he might have taken and gotten away with. He's really saying something beyond what the politics of the occasion required him to say. I think he was probably quite moved by the Satius letter. Satius, by the way, in my opinion, ought to get credit as one of the first presidential speechwriters because Washington took so much of his language and used it again in his letter. I want also to say that there were tiny but important examples of Americans who were somewhat indebted or interested in or believed in Islam at the same time. I mean, very small numbers of Jews in the United States at this time, but and even smaller numbers of Muslims, but there were a few, and they're interesting. And I've spoken on this topic in different settings, but both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams owned a copy of the Quran, and Jefferson's copy is in the Library of Congress now, and it was used by our first Muslim congressman, Keith Ellison from Minnesota, who was sworn in with his hand on Jefferson's Quran, which caused no little flare-up of controversy in some precincts on the evangelical right, but it was an important statement that we really are a people of many nations, and that Americans were aware distantly that there were other traditions, it's a European tradition also. And it's not only a religious tradition, but the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was often held up in a way that we tend not to look at the Islamic world today, but as a place where forms of tolerance were rather advanced, that Christians and Jews were often permitted to stay in their congregations and observe their rituals throughout the weak governing structure of the Ottoman Empire. Pat?
This question is probably not as well formed as it could be, but I wonder if you can talk about the difference between what is commonly thought of as freedom of religion and religious tolerance. It strikes me that there is a difference, and that sometimes what's called freedom of religion is actually used as an excuse for being intolerant.
I know there's a correct answer to that question. I'm not sure I have it. I tend to use the words interchangeably, but as Alan said, toleration, the nouns are a little bit more accepting of entry from all groups, and to tolerate is a more active way that implies one group beginning the act of toleration and therefore permitting others to come into it. Between toleration and tolerance, is that your question, Pat? Did I rephrase it in my thinking about it?
I was talking about a different phrase, and that is the one that we learn in school when we learn about the First Amendment, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which summarizes, and perhaps not always accurately summarizes, a variety of concepts regarding establishment of religion or disestablishment in the First Amendment. But freedom of religion is the common parlance. It's when you ask people, what does the First Amendment stand for? That's one of the phrases that you get back. And it strikes me that there is a difference between the concept of freedom of religion and religious tolerance. And I think, to take a current example, the upset in the modern Catholic Church about Catholic institutions, hospitals, and universities that are being asked to provide birth control services for their employees. One side can say, you're violating my freedom of religion. The other side can say, you're violating my freedom of religion. And the concept of tolerance seems to have completely disappeared.
I'm glad you went further, because it sounded like you had the answer already better formed than I did. I wonder if I might ask Alan Wolfe to reflect a little bit on that question. Is Alan still here? Because Alan has written a lot on this topic. Freedom of religion, or it's also called freedom of worship, is one of the four freedoms. So I think of that as having a special U.S. context that comes out of the First Amendment, but then was reified during the early 1940s when Roosevelt defined it first in the Atlantic Charter, and then the Four Freedoms, and Norman Rockwell did the famous painting of what is happening in that painting. A family is in a pew in a church. I'm trying to remember the painting, Freedom of Religion. Well, Alan, why don't I let you talk?
I think I know what Pat was driving at. I mean, I compare the point she's making to the change in the notion of freedom of speech that was embodied by the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case, where freedom of speech had always meant an individual freedom to speak out. Suddenly it's granted to an institution or to a corporation. And when you argue that a corporation or an institution has freedom of speech, it means something entirely different from the idea that freedom of speech is necessary to cultivate qualities of the mind, as in John Stuart Mill. And it indeed can, if a corporation has that kind of freedom, it can use it to actually suppress the freedom of speech of workers and other people. In a similar way, freedom of religion, I think, was always conceived of as an individual right, a right to worship as you please. But now, if the Catholic Church uses it to defend its institutional prerogatives, it's saying the freedom belongs to the organization. And if that organization, well, to take some cases, for example, if the Mormon Church would say that freedom of religion gives us the right only to hire Mormons to work for us, which was a Supreme Court case, then all of a sudden the freedom of religion becomes an excuse for denying individuals.
Such a good answer. Did you all hear that answer? It was really lucid, and I think that's what Pat was getting at. So it's a distinction between the individual's right and an increasingly corporate sense of who possesses that right. Any other questions? Laura?
There's a kind of politically correct term, inclusiveness, that I wonder if you would comment on it a little bit in the context of what we've all been puzzling about just now, and what do we mean by tolerance, toleration, freedom of religion, because that word bigotry that Washington also brings up goes well beyond saying, well, you have a freedom to leave, you have a freedom to get away from me, and really bigotry, rejecting bigotry says there's something more there to the other. And I don't know the context of the letter until your speech was advertised. I'd never read it. So I think every word in it is precious in the context of the words. I wondered if you would talk a little bit about possibly what inclusiveness or non-inclusiveness he was wrestling with as he used a word like bigotry.
Well, I don't think he was guilty of, he was, like so many Virginians, a member of what had been the Church of England and was being called the Episcopalian Church. He worshipped in Alexandria, Virginia, and I don't think he personally committed any bigotry, and I think he obviously was trying to paint as broad a picture as possible for a then still pretty small nation of about 3 million people that everyone knew was going to grow very large in the 19th century. And he knew that everything he did set an important precedent, but I think he had the particular local situation in Rhode Island on his mind, and I think he was smart enough to know Rhode Island's own history with religion. It was the thing that set Rhode Island apart from its New England neighbors, and I think Washington was smart enough to know that. Do I know that he read Roger Williams? I do not. I believe that Thomas Jefferson read Roger Williams, but it's hard to prove. There isn't Roger Williams in the huge Jefferson library that went into the Library of Congress, but the phrase "a wall of separation" was used by Roger Williams. So I think many of it's a very interesting question, to what extent were the founders, the 18th century founders, studying the 17th century founders, the colonial founders. But I think also he was aware that there was a growing tension over issues related to immigration, and recent immigrants, recent French and Irish and English immigrants were pouring into the United States in 1790, and were part of the upset to the calm, unilateral, sort of one-party world that George Washington was comfortable in. They were beginning to agitate at the lower regions of the American political structure and to tilt things towards what would become the Jeffersonian, Republican, and then Democratic part of American politics, the rabble-rousers. And he was disturbed by that, and I think every time he could say something public about balance, about inclusivity, he wanted to do it. I mean, for him, the emergent two-party schism was deeply personal. I mean, it's very, very early in 1790, and I can't even quite remember if the first steps have happened at this point, but for him it's personal because it's happening to his right and his left inside of his own cabinet. It's happening with Hamilton and Jefferson, his two closest advisors, who are the two individuals who are beginning this schism. And Washington is torn by it. He ultimately goes in a Hamiltonian direction, but he doesn't want to go in either direction. And then we mentioned slavery a little bit earlier, too. And so bigotry, the word bigotry, he's talking about it in a religious context, but I think he was certainly aware of other ways in which Americans could be capable of bigotry. So in his modest way, without saying too much, without saying something radical, he was trying to say something inspirational and succeeded. I mean, this was not the only document he signed on the subject of Judaism. He wrote similar things in a few other places, but somehow this particular letter has resonated the longest, partly because it's so important to Newport and to Rhode Island, and that congregation was unusually significant. It was significant for being, it's the second oldest in the United States. There is a congregation in New York that is older, but has the oldest house of worship. And so Toro is a very important architectural monument to inclusivity, and the fact that it included political meetings for the state of Rhode Island, I think, is also highly symbolic. And so in all of these ways, Washington's letter to Newport had ripples far beyond its immediate effect right in the room, he wrote it as a letter to the people who received the letter. And I think he knew that. He was smart enough, he pretended not to be a politician, but in fact he was a very smart politician, and everything he did lasted a long time. And this letter may get more, if John and I and others can succeed in getting it out more in the limelight than it has been. I mean, it has been disturbing to friends of exactly this cause that it's privately owned. Sometimes great public documents are privately, it happens all the time. Presidential documents and documents of state get out of one family's control and get out into the marketplace. And this particular letter was purchased, I want to say in the 50s, is that right, John? By an individual who then loaned it for a long time to the B'nai B'rith Museum in Washington, D.C., where it was somewhat visible, but you had to know where it was. It wasn't the easiest place to find. And then it was taken out of that building within the last 10 years, I think, maybe in the 2003, 4, and that has been disturbing to scholars because just, it's in a warehouse. It's been kept in a warehouse outside of Washington, D.C., and we need to keep track of these documents for millions of people. So I commend John for the work he's done, and I'm really happy that Philadelphia Museum has succeeded in putting it on display.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ted Widmer. You have been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in September 2012, co-sponsored by the Longfellow House Washington's Headquarters National Historic Site, the Friends of the Longfellow House Washington's Headquarters, the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For more information about this program, entitled Religious Tolerance in America, featuring Ted Widmer, or about our ongoing radio series and Forum Network webcasts, Visit us on the web at cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm J.L. Bell. Thanks for joining us.